Welcome to Reinventing Parking, the podcast about parking policy for anyone who wants a better city and better urban transport. Welcome back to the Reinventing Parking podcast. I'm your host, Paul Barter. In one of our 2019 episodes, I spoke with Tony Jordan about Portlanders for parking reform. And near the end, he teased us all by saying he was planning something bigger. Well, the time has come, and today we're talking about the new Parking Reform Network. My guests for this episode are two of the initiators of that network, which has the goal of inspiring and supporting parking reformers all over the United States and hopefully beyond in the future. So let me introduce Lindsay Bayley and Jane Wilderbing, who are both in Chicago. Lindsay's day job is senior planner at the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning, CMAP, where, among other things, she manages parking studies in the Chicago neighborhoods and in suburban downtowns. Jane's day job is as a consultant with Sam Schwartz, where she works with cities, developers, and institutions on parking management, transportation demand management, and curbside management. Now, that's all very, very relevant, but we should emphasize that they're speaking in their personal capacities today, not for their employers, although to some extent they are speaking for the Parking Reform Network. So welcome to Reinventing Parking.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us, yeah.
We want to focus on the new network, the new Parking Reform Network in this episode, and we have a mission to encourage the listeners, join the Parking Reform Network. Please, please, please join the Parking Reform Network. But we're recording this in early June 2020, and I think it's day 15 or so of the huge wave of Black Lives Matter protests that have been sweeping the United States and beyond, in fact, all over the world. So I want to start with issues that relate to that. It might surprise some listeners that parking actually has some connection with issues of social equity, policing, and the justice system. And I know, Lindsay, you've thought about this quite a bit. Do you have any thoughts on how people in the Parking Reform Network can be responding to this moment?
Yeah. Usually we start to hear about issues of equity when we are coming to a neighborhood and saying that in order to better manage the parking supply, some of the parking should have meters. And so when you're asking people to pay for something that they're used to getting for free, all of a sudden people come out of everywhere concerned about the equity issues when you have additional financial burdens. But when we really dig into the issues in our country of systemic racism, it's kind of like pulling on a string on a sweater. There are just so many ways in which our nation has used transportation, housing, lending practices, and land use policies to really limit the growth of wealth in Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities, and ultimately with the end result of oppressing them. I mean, we could dedicate an entire hour to that topic alone. So when we start to talk about parking, it's really, there are so many layers, and cars have played different roles in the Black community specifically. We have the history of building highways through Black neighborhoods to enable unfettered access to downtown jobs for white people fleeing to the suburbs. And we have the issue of routine traffic stops being used to stop Black motorists and so many other issues.
That one's an interesting one. What can we do to reduce that risk?
Well, I know that there have been a lot of people advocating for a transition to more automated enforcement, and I generally support those ideas, but we have had researchers in Chicago show that even automated traffic cameras end up impacting the Black community more than anyone else. And sometimes that has to do with the design of the roadways. Jane, did you want to weigh in on this? I feel like you had other thoughts to add.
Yeah, thinking even more high level about it is just the way that a lot of cities in downtowns tend to approach ticketing as it's a line item, and it's in their budget. They're really depending on that revenue coming in. And when you are saying to the powers that be, we are going to make at least X amount of dollars on ticketing, you then kind of put that pressure on the police force. There's this number that has to be met. And if it's not, then that's when they kind of look for more petty things, such as parking and ticketing. And as a rule of thumb, parking enforcement should never really be something from a revenue perspective that you're dependent on, as opposed to something that's kind of a bonus.
That's a really good point, Jane. Parking reformers have been saying that don't focus on the revenue, focus on effective parking management. The revenue will follow, but if you focus on revenue, you get all of these nasty side effects, including the escalating fines. And this was an issue in Ferguson, wasn't it? That it came out that the police department was basically funding itself from fining low-income people. Yeah. So you had a point about that, Lindsay?
Well, I was thinking, or I wanted to make the point that the main equity issue that I think parking reformers have an opportunity to address is shifting the cost of parking onto drivers and off of the general public. Because right now, with parking requirements, when we have to build something, everyone ends up paying for it, regardless of how much they use their car. So at my grocery store, it has a parking garage. So I have to pay more for my groceries so that other people can park for free, even though I don't have a car. And in the housing world, you want to see more housing for people and more affordable options. But when you have to build that parking, it gets really expensive, and you end up limiting the amount of housing you can build and making that housing more expensive. And once drivers have to actually pay for that cost of parking, they drive less and they might get rid of additional cars. And I think that's where we can really see a lot of change.
And just to add to that a little bit more, when everyone's paying for it, then even people who are transit dependent, who don't even have cars, are paying for people to drive and to park. And these transit dependent people for years have had really limited, unviable options because of the way that this funding is structured. And when parking reform is successful, it really leverages those other modes and those other options so that there are more options for all users, as opposed to just those who can afford vehicles.
There are some ironies here, aren't there? Because all of us have had the experience that when we advocate for parking reform, for example, advocating for more effective pricing, we get accused of being anti-equity very often and of ignoring how this will affect low-income people. But that's just such a tiny part of the story, and the bigger picture, of which that pricing is an inherent part, is very much pro-equity. And many of us are actually motivated by these wider equity goals.
Yeah, I think, we're hearing a lot right now about the line item of police in our budgets. But if you also add in roads and police are usually the two biggest things in any municipal budget. Michael Manville has a quote that I might not say exactly right, but something like, people who are concerned about pricing roads but not concerned about roads that are free are more concerned about the pricing than the poor.
And I think it is in the Access magazine of UCLA. But the idea was that if you're worried about the equity problems of pricing transportation properly, including parking, then wait till we show you the equity problems of free parking and free transportation. That's
exactly
words to that effect. Let's just briefly, before we move on, housing and inequity seems to me to be really central, and a lot of people in this last 2 weeks have been highlighting that so much of this comes down to exclusionary housing policies all over the United States, and parking is actually deeply embedded in those exclusionary practices, isn't it? Parking reformers in many places where they've been successful, it's often been with allies from the affordable housing movement. And that's no accident because it's so central to what we're trying to achieve. Do you have comments on that housing connection? Part of it is unbundling as well, which relates back to what you said before, Lindsay, about if you don't have a car, why should you be paying for other people's cars? That is most obvious and most extreme when it comes to housing. If you're living in multifamily housing with bundled parking, you're paying for other people's parking if you don't have a car.
Yeah, that's exactly why Portland has been so successful in building a big on the ground network of people who are advocating for changes in City Hall to say we need to change this because they see the affordability problems and their friends being priced out. And getting the parking reformers and the people concerned about transportation to talk to the affordable housing advocates was really a pivotal point in building their network.
Yeah, and I'm just going back a little bit. The minimum parking requirement is really the key to unlocking a lot of affordability. Trying to kind of flip the switch on that has been a really important part of creating more affordability in housing and really creating more vibrant downtowns across the country.
Right, yes. And I really hope that some of the people who very often have their hearts in the right place when it comes to, say, race issues or social equity issues, but are opposing abolishing parking minimums because of supposedly parking in their streets. I really hope some of those people will look into their hearts and ask themselves, is what's really going on here, maybe not for you, but maybe for some of the allies against parking minimums, are you accidentally aligning yourself with people whose real agenda is keeping the wrong sort of people out of your neighbourhood? If that's the case, please rethink your opposition to minimum parking requirements and to parking light housing, affordable housing in your neighbourhoods. End of speech.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a great point. I think a lot of the opposition is driven by fear, and it's fear of the unknown because they've never known not having a free parking spot. It's fear of change because they're so used to having their parking there and they don't know what they're going to do without it, and they don't know how other people are going to behave. So it's once someone puts a negative thought in their mind, someone that opposes it will obviously do that. And then it kind of catches like wildfire. So in the end, you might have a similar goal of, having a more vibrant community, but you might just not be as educated on how to get there and what those implications mean. And that's a really important piece of parking reform and what we're trying to achieve through the Parking Reform Network.
Yeah, and I would add that we see these problems on our streets of all the parking spaces are full. We need to do something about it. And that maybe if you don't know a lot about parking, you would say, well, obviously we need to have more. And the problem is really that we don't have a good system to manage parking. So using pricing to balance demand on street. And when we try to solve the problem with these off-street parking requirements, it doesn't actually improve the situation. You still have the on-street congestion. And particularly we'll see in gentrifying communities, as wealthier people move in, they tend to own more vehicles. So they bring this increase of cars to the neighborhood. So that adds to the tension in a community where you're pricing people out.
Yeah. People get very territorial about parking, especially parking in the streets, don't they? And that territoriality is driven by sort of what they just see immediately, what they perceive in their own experience of arriving and finding it frustrating that where they usually park, they can't park.
The issue that people keep bringing up is there's not enough parking, build more parking. It's a management issue, but it's also an issue regarding how do you know how much parking you have and understanding that number and monitoring it. It is always surprising to me how it's very rare that a city or downtown or institution has a really solid handle on how many spaces they have, when spaces are being used, just doing some of those basic utilization counts. And that's really the key to creating a successful parking system is to really understand what you're doing or understand what you have and then understand how to manage it.
Parking reformers, we have this challenge, don't we, of trying to make a connection between that visceral experience that people have, especially as motorists, and connecting that with the more wonkish, data-driven thinking that you've been sort of alluding to, Jane. And it's hard to it's hard to persuade someone who's just angry about the parking in their street that, wait a minute, here's some inventory, and here's a study, here's the, how can we be persuasive as parking reformers when it's so emotional?
I have found keypad polling with some particular questions to be really effective. We kind of like to pry out what kind of parker people are, and we group them into the different categories. Jane's better at remembering what they are, but there's the convenience-minded person, and that person is willing to pay. Obviously, we all prefer not to, but willing to pay if it means that you get a spot right in front and you don't have to walk very far. And then you have your bargain hunters. So there are the ones who will do anything to not pay. So that could be they park really far away and walk, or it could be they don't come shopping in your downtown anymore because you now charge parking. And then you have the
Logical.
Oh yeah, logical, reasonable. They'll just pay if they have to, walk if they want to save money, and figure out what works for them. And then when you can see that different people have different opinions on that when they vote for which one they are, I myself am the bargain hunter. I avoid paying at all costs. I'd rather walk further. But then you show people that when you have meters, you actually give a choice to people. And we're trying to promote that option.
Yes. Yeah, I often try to frame this in terms of choice, which raises an issue of interesting bedfellows, because I, for one, don't see this as an ideological left-right or green, anti-green issue. It cuts across so many issues. There's this sort of core technocratic issue of good management, which is very, very important, but it's not the motivating thing for most of us, is it? I've lost my train of thought.
No, I mean, I would just add that parking is an extremely emotional issue. And, whenever we go to these public meetings or talk to people about it, it's very easy for them to get defensive. But the more you're able to kind of take them into a bigger picture and get into those numbers, numbers don't really lie. I've always found that that's been the most shocking, eye-opening part of these public meetings, is to show them, this is actually how much parking there is in this downtown area. If you put on an aerial map, you just don't see it because you're going into an individual spot each and every day. So numbers, there is that interesting juxtaposition between numbers and being extremely emotional about your parking spot. But when you're able to kind of communicate them in a way that is more comprehensive, that is really the most effective way to start realizing some of those changes and getting people to open their minds up a little bit more.
I also really like to, I like to have interviews with people. I feel like I get the most interesting perspectives on what different people are seeing when they're on the ground and what their habits are. And then I'm able to use those thoughts when I'm talking to other people. I'll find out about somebody who is driving a very short distance to get to their job and parking there all day in the neighborhood where there's a parking problem. And then I can say to somebody else, oh, well, there are people who are driving that could walk, or they could ride a bike, or they could take transit. But because there's free parking, they will use it. And just sort of help use their own observations to come to an appropriate solution.
Okay, we've got this frustration, this immediate frustration about parking, and some of us in the Parking Reform Network, we also, walking the streets, we see parking on sidewalks, which makes us angry. Parking in bike lanes makes us angry, etc. We see the waste of huge empty wastelands of parking blighting cities. It's a visceral reaction. One of the answers to all of that is a technocratic answer of, look, just good parking management. We have all these reforms that can fix all of this. But that doesn't excite people. And yet we do see this flowering of passion. It may sound funny to anyone who's not involved, but those of us in the parking reform movement and the parking reform network know that some of us are, many of us are very passionate about parking, and we see so much hope that it can help, along with other reforms, to make cities and lives so much better. And that's still emotional. It's getting back to emotional, but it's slow thinking emotions, I guess. And so Lindsay was sort of touching on when you interview people, you're trying to get at what do they value, what do they really want from their community. So then we can give them answers from the technocratic toolkit, but we really need to engage people at an emotional level, but at a slow thinking and emotional sort of deliberative discussion. What do we want? Does that resonate?
Yeah, definitely. I think another really important part is getting other people from the community to help explain the ideas that you're talking about in parking management. And I like to tell the story of working in this small town where they were really afraid of increasing the meter price. And I told them all the things about parking management, and they kind of nodded their heads. Yeah, I get it. And then we had a business owner from another community come in and talk about his experience and how his community, when they raised the meter prices, the challenges they had, but how it actually worked. And when we talked to our steering committee after that meeting, they said, yeah, when Lindsay said it, I was like, I get it, but I don't know. But once the business owner, who is a business owner like me, explained it, it made a lot more sense. And I was able to get on board with that. So we just feel like it's helpful to have champions when you're not just the outsider coming in.
And maybe that's a good spot to jump back to our initial goal with this conversation, was to talk about the making of parking reformers. I guess the Parking Reform Network envisages that out there across the world, there are people who are somewhat interested in parking and hoping to make some difference, but maybe not. They don't know where to get started. What makes an effective parking reformer, and how can we encourage them, and how is the Parking Reform Network planning to do that?
Yeah, I think that a successful parking reformer is honestly just someone who is aware of the issues around parking. I mean, it is at the root of a lot of issues that people deeply care about, including housing and transportation and equity and economic development, and just understanding and being educated about how those relate and are dependent upon one another to kind of create the successful urban area or even suburban area would basically make a great parking reformer, especially if they're willing to talk to anyone about it, and more importantly, everyone about it.
How would someone get from caring and having maybe they've read Donald Shoup perhaps, and they've gone online and read some of your stuff online, Better Parking 101. They get excited. What can they do next?
Well, we always say that it's important to know what's happening in your community. And we do have a couple of local chapters of the Parking Reform Network. There's a group out of Detroit. There's a group in Portland. And I think we're hoping that more people will try to build their local organization so that they can start to identify parts of their own ordinances or regulations that are creating conditions that make it harder for affordable housing or better transit. And they can bring people into the fold to show up for public meetings and advocate for changes.
I always like to encourage people to, if you have the time and if you have the energy and passion to go out and do a count. It's a great way to get started in terms of getting people to see and understand what some of the issues are, and then to kind of taking that to some of the local leaders or even a public meeting, and just, having some kind of data to add to the story.
Perhaps can you describe, Lindsay, if someone joins the Parking Reform Network hoping to learn more about what they could do in their local community, what will they find once they join? What are some of those resources? For example, the Slack group looks like it's becoming quite valuable.
Yeah, the Slack group has been really great. We've had members posting webinars that they're involved on. We also are forming different committees to help with different topics like research, communications, fundraising. I think we want to be able to help people do their own parking turnover survey or just an occupancy survey. And we're happy to assist people if they want that. We can provide some tools, whether it's Excel tables, very basic, because I personally have found that the simple pencil and paper on a clipboard walking around is the best way, sometimes on bike, but to do your own study, I don't use digital fancy tools.
Yeah, I was struck in the Parking Reform Network Slack just this morning as I was looking. Somebody was sharing a spreadsheet that they've prepared to help people do parking counts of off-street parking, say in apartments, because he found that people just don't believe him when he says, look, this apartment, the parking is only 1/3 full, even at 3 a.m. And he wanted to document it more carefully. And then he was sharing his tools for that. So that's the kind of thing, isn't it?
We also have a link library. So for member access, we have been collecting any news article, we tag them and they're sorted, and it can be by cities or by topic if you're interested in performance-based pricing or parking maximums. We have different topics that are accessible.
Speaking of topics, maybe just to finish up, if someone's interested in parking and they've sort of read up a little bit and they know that, okay, demand-based on-street parking pricing is part of it, getting some of that revenue into the hands of maybe low-income people, or having the community decide where the revenue goes according to their own needs is part of it. Off-street parking and parking minimums and parking unbundling is part of it. They know all these things, but they're wondering where they should start. Which issue do you think has the most traction most commonly? I mean, every community is different, of course, but which one seems to excite people and get things going fastest in your experience?
Well, I would say at the moment, I've been working on a lot of curbside management studies. I think that is something that's been really popular and has been gaining a lot of momentum. Even before COVID-19, there's a lot going on in terms of curbside pickup drop off with Uber and Lyft. There is a lot with who is the curb really for, and it historically has been for vehicle storage long term. Being more judicious about who is using the curb and when and how, and pricing it more strategically has been something that a lot of cities and downtowns and districts and institutions are really interested in managing better.
Let's see, I would probably say that getting rid of minimum parking requirements would be the area that I would focus initial attention on. And I think
Some conflict. You disagree?
Well, we complement each other. It's all part of the system, on street and off street. I'm a member of the Strong Towns Network, and I think there's a lot of overlap between that movement and the Parking Reform Network. We're a little bit more niche, but they have been advocating for a long time about the absurdity of minimum parking requirements. And I think as we've seen with dramatic shifts in the demand for parking and where it is, that developers are more attuned to what is happening on the ground than municipal planners, and forcing them to overbuild isn't helping our communities.
Is there anything I've forgotten that you were bursting to say?
Become a member of the Parking Reform Network.
Yes.
Yes. Is there a website we should tell people?
Parkingreform.org.
Parkingreform.org. There you go.
I guess just to add to join the Parking Reform Network, this movement and this network is very much in its infancy stages. So we're really excited about hearing more input from anyone who's interested and getting to know more about the members and really getting this off the ground and making it more of a concerted kind of unified effort. So please just feel free to reach out and join. And, we're excited to grow the organization with you.
And should someone who's a beginner in parking reform feel welcome to join?
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Jane. Thank you so much, Lindsay, for being on the Reinventing Parking podcast.
Thank you, Paul.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
You've been listening to the Reinventing Parking podcast, and I'm Paul Barter. You can find out more at reinventingparking.org, where you'll find ideas and tips on parking policy. You can also listen to other episodes, subscribe, or leave a comment. That's reinventingparking.org. Bye for now.